Have you ever noticed how the smallest promises are the ones that quietly rewrite your life? If someone had asked me that question a year ago, I would have laughed and gone back to sanding another oak tabletop in my tiny workshop. My name is Noah Bennett. I was 27 years old, and I had become very good at living alone. My mornings began with coffee strong enough to wake the entire neighborhood. My afternoons disappeared beneath the scent of fresh-cut cedar and maple, and my evenings ended with old jazz records echoing through a house that always felt just a little too quiet. After a relationship that had lasted nearly 5 years slowly unraveled, I convinced myself that peace was better than hope. Peace did not disappoint you. Peace did not leave boxes on the front porch or memories in every room. It simply asked you to keep moving one ordinary day at a time. The neighborhood suited that idea perfectly. Tree-lined streets, children riding bicycles after school, neighbors who waved without expecting long conversations, and porches glowing with warm lights after sunset. It felt like the kind of place where nothing remarkable ever happened. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, a moving truck pulled into the driveway next door. I watched through my workshop window as furniture disappeared into the little blue house that had been empty for months. A tall man with dark brown hair carried boxes with steady determination, while a little boy in a bright yellow raincoat splashed through puddles as if rain had been invented solely for his entertainment. They looked tired but strangely hopeful, like people trying very hard to believe they had finally arrived somewhere they could call home. I thought about introducing myself, but years of keeping to myself won the argument, and I returned to the cabinet I had been building for a local customer. By evening, the rain had grown heavier, drumming against the roof while the smell of sawdust mixed with fresh coffee. I was cleaning my workbench when someone knocked on my front door. It was not the quick knock of a delivery driver or the familiar rhythm of a neighbor borrowing a tool. It was hesitant, polite, almost apologetic. When I opened the door, the man from next door stood beneath my porch light, rain clinging to his navy jacket. Up close, he looked about my age, maybe a little older, with kind hazel eyes carrying the unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had been responsible for too much for too long. "Hi," he said with an embarrassed smile. "I'm Ethan Walker. I hate to ask this when we've barely met." Before I could answer, the little boy peeked out from behind him, clutching a stuffed dinosaur almost as large as his backpack. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward his own house before looking back at me. "The school just called. There's an emergency meeting I have to attend tonight, and my usual babysitter canceled at the last minute. Would you be willing to watch Lucas for about an hour?" I completely understand if the answer is no. It was such a small request, the kind anyone might make in a friendly neighborhood. Every sensible part of me wanted to politely decline. I hardly knew this man. I had plans, even if those plans only involved leftover chili and finishing a sketch for tomorrow's client. But Lucas looked up at me with curious blue eyes instead of expectation, and Ethan's expression held more concern than desperation. Something about that quiet honesty made saying no feel impossible. I stepped back from the doorway and smiled for the first time that day. "An hour," I said. "I think I can manage an hour." Neither of us could have imagined that those simple words would become the beginning of a story neither of us had been looking for, yet somehow both of us desperately needed. Lucas turned out to be nothing like I expected. Instead of bouncing from room to room or asking endless questions, he wandered quietly through my workshop with the kind of careful curiosity that made me smile without realizing it. He stopped in front of a half-finished rocking horse, ran his fingertips gently across the smooth oak, and looked up at me with wide blue eyes. "Did you make this?" he asked. I nodded, and his face lit up as though I had admitted to performing real magic. For the next hour, we talked about wood, birds, dinosaurs, and why maple smelled different from cedar after it had been sanded. He listened to every answer with complete seriousness before sharing stories of his own, most of them involving school, soccer, or the imaginary adventures of the stuffed dinosaur tucked beneath his arm. It had been a long time since laughter had echoed naturally through my house, and hearing it again made the rooms feel strangely unfamiliar in the best possible way. I found an old box of colored pencils, and together we sketched a treehouse that somehow ended up with a pirate flag, a telescope, and a slide twisting around the trunk. Lucas insisted every good treehouse needed a place where people could drink hot chocolate while it rained outside. I told him that sounded less like a treehouse and more like the perfect place to spend a Saturday afternoon, and he grinned proudly as though he had solved an important problem adults had overlooked. By the time headlights swept across my driveway, I was surprised to discover nearly 2 hours had passed. Ethan hurried up the porch steps, carrying an apologetic expression that reached his eyes before his words did. "I am so sorry," he said. The meeting ran much longer than anyone expected. Before I could answer, Lucas rushed toward him, talking so quickly that half the words blended together. He described the rocking horse, the drawings, the smell of fresh wood, and announced with complete confidence that I knew how to make almost anything. Ethan looked from his son to the sketches scattered across my kitchen table and let out a quiet laugh that sounded as though it had been missing from his life for a while. He thanked me more times than necessary and reached into his pocket, clearly intending to offer payment. But I shook my head before he could say another word. "It was only a couple of hours," I said. "Besides, I had good company." Ethan hesitated for a moment before returning the money to his wallet. "Then at least let me bring you dinner sometime," he replied. "That seems a little more neighborly." I almost declined out of habit, but something about the easy sincerity in his voice made refusing feel unnecessary. "Dinner sounds fair," I admitted. As they walked back, across the damp lawn beneath the glow of the streetlights, Lucas turned around and waved with both hands, shouting that he wanted to finish the treehouse drawing another day. I waved back until they disappeared inside the blue house next door. My workshop was just as quiet as it had always been, yet it no longer felt empty. The unfinished rocking horse still waited on the bench, the colored pencils remained scattered across the table, and one small paper drawing had been accidentally left behind. In bright green crayon, Lucas had written 3 simple words beneath the crooked treehouse. "See you soon." I smiled to myself, convinced it was only the innocent promise of a child. I had no idea those words would quietly become part of my own routine before either Ethan or I realized how much our ordinary lives had already begun to overlap. The dinner Ethan promised arrived 2 evenings later in the form of a large casserole dish that smelled like roasted chicken, herbs, and fresh vegetables. He stood on my porch with an easy smile, while Lucas balanced a paper bag filled with warm dinner rolls as though it were the most important job in the world. I invited them inside, and what I expected to be a quick thank you meal quietly stretched into nearly 3 hours of conversation. Ethan told me funny stories about teaching high school history, especially the creative excuses students invented for unfinished homework. I shared the occasional disaster from custom furniture projects, including the time a client insisted on measuring an entire dining room in centimeters before realizing every contractor in town worked in inches. Lucas laughed so hard that he nearly spilled his apple juice, and before long the conversation felt less like 3 people getting acquainted and more like old friends rediscovering one another. After that evening, unexpected routines began appearing without anyone planning them. On Saturday mornings, Ethan often stopped by carrying coffee from the neighborhood cafe, because he knew I usually forgot to eat breakfast when I became absorbed in work. In return, I fixed a loose cabinet door in his kitchen after noticing it squeaked every time Lucas reached for a cereal bowl. Neither of us kept score. Small acts of kindness simply flowed back and forth as naturally as neighbors waving across a fence. Lucas became a regular visitor to my workshop, where I let him sand scrap pieces of pine while wearing a pair of oversized safety goggles that constantly slid down his nose. He proudly announced that he was my assistant, although his main responsibility seemed to involve asking whether every new project could secretly become a treehouse. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited me to watch Lucas play in a youth soccer game at the local park. I almost declined out of habit, worried I might intrude on their family time, but Ethan insisted that Lucas had been asking all week whether I would come. The field buzzed with parents unfolding lawn chairs, children racing across bright green grass, and coaches calling out encouragement beneath a cloudless blue sky. Lucas spotted me before the game even started and waved both arms high above his head with such excitement that several parents turned to see who had earned such an enthusiastic greeting. Ethan laughed quietly beside me and shook his head. "He has been talking about your workshop every day," he admitted. "I think he believes you can build absolutely anything. Only if he keeps supplying ideas," I replied, earning another easy smile from Ethan. Throughout the game, we found ourselves cheering together without thinking about it. Sometimes our shoulders brushed as we leaned forward to watch a close play, and neither of us hurried to move away. There was something unexpectedly comfortable about sharing those ordinary moments, as though life had decided to introduce companionship so gradually that it never felt overwhelming. After the final whistle, Lucas sprinted toward us, slightly out of breath, but grinning despite his muddy sneakers. He reached for both of our hands at the same time, while excitedly describing nearly every minute of the game. Neither Ethan nor I commented on it. We simply walked together toward the parking lot beneath the warm afternoon sun, listening to Lucas retell the match with growing enthusiasm. As we passed another family loading sports equipment into their car, an older woman smiled warmly at the three of us and said, "You have such a beautiful family." Ethan and I exchanged startled glances for only a heartbeat before politely thanking her without correcting the misunderstanding. We continued walking in thoughtful silence, but something about those unexpected words stayed with me long after I returned home, leaving me to wonder why they felt less uncomfortable than they probably should have. The weeks drifted by with the quiet rhythm that only a comfortable neighborhood seemed able to create. Without ever discussing it, Ethan and I slipped into habits that felt surprisingly natural. If I noticed his porch lights still glowing late at night, I usually guessed he was grading papers, and the next morning I would leave a fresh cinnamon roll from the bakery on his front step before starting work. If he saw that my workshop lights were still on after dinner, he often appeared carrying a thermos of hot coffee with a smile that somehow made the long hours seem lighter. It never felt like either of us was trying too hard. We were simply making each other's ordinary days a little easier. Lucas seemed convinced that every Saturday belonged to all three of us. One weekend, he insisted that we build a birdhouse together in my workshop. He took his role very seriously, carefully handing me screws that were much too large for the project and proudly brushing away sawdust that returned almost immediately. Ethan laughed as he watched his son concentrate with complete determination, and I realized I had not heard laughter like that inside my house for years. When the birdhouse was finally finished, it leaned ever so slightly to one side. But Lucas declared it perfect because, according to him, birds did not care if a house was perfectly straight as long as it felt safe. His words lingered in my mind long after we hung the little birdhouse in the maple tree between our yards. A few days later, I noticed one of Ethan's kitchen shelves had begun to sag under the weight of heavy cookbooks. I offered to replace it while Lucas was at school. Ethan protested at first, saying he could hire someone, but I reminded him that I happened to know a furniture maker who worked only a few steps away. By lunchtime, the shelf was stronger than before, and Ethan insisted on thanking me with homemade vegetable soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. We ate at the kitchen table while soft autumn sunlight spilled through the windows, talking about everything from favorite childhood movies to the places we had once dreamed of visiting. There were moments when the conversation slowed, yet the silence no longer felt awkward. It felt peaceful, as though neither of us needed to fill every quiet space with words. The following Friday evening, the elementary school hosted a family craft night, and Ethan invited me to come because Lucas wanted help building a model bridge. The gymnasium buzzed with cheerful conversations, colorful decorations, and children proudly showing off glitter-covered projects. As we worked together around a crowded table, Lucas stood between us, giving enthusiastic instructions that changed every few minutes. At one point, he stepped back to admire the bridge, then reached for both of our sleeves and pulled us a little closer so we could all fit into the same photograph another parent offered to take. We smiled without thinking, and for a brief second it felt completely natural. A teacher passing by glanced at the picture and warmly said, "Your son looks so happy." Neither Ethan nor I corrected the assumption. We simply exchanged an uncertain look before Lucas tugged us toward another activity with endless excitement. Driving home later that evening, I found myself replaying those simple words instead of dismissing them. I could not explain why they stayed with me, only that somewhere between shared meals, small repairs, and ordinary afternoons, the blue house next door no longer felt like the place where my neighbors lived. It had quietly become one of the places where I felt most at home, and that realization was both comforting and unexpectedly frightening. Autumn settled gently over the neighborhood, painting the maple trees in deep shades of gold and crimson, while everyday life continued with a comforting rhythm that had quietly become familiar to all three of us. 1. Monday morning, I unlocked my workshop to find Ethan standing outside with 2 cups of coffee balanced carefully in one hand. He smiled in the easy way that had become so natural between us. "I figured you forgot breakfast again," he said, handing me the larger cup before I even admitted he was right. We spent a few minutes talking about nothing important at all, yet those ordinary conversations somehow became the part of each day I looked forward to the most. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected email from a design company in Seattle. Months earlier, I had submitted a portfolio for a furniture studio that specialized in handcrafted interiors, never expecting to hear back. Now they were inviting me to interview for a lead designer position, complete with a larger workshop, talented collaborators, and opportunities one had imagined since college. It was exactly the kind of career breakthrough I had always hoped for. I stared at the message for several minutes without replying. Instead of feeling excited, I found myself glancing through the workshop window toward the blue house next door. That evening, Ethan invited Lucas and me to dinner after Lucas proudly announced he had earned a perfect spelling test. We celebrated with homemade pasta, laughter, and a chocolate cake that leaned almost as much as the birdhouse we had built together. During dinner, Ethan mentioned that his principal had encouraged him to apply for an assistant principal position opening at the school the following semester. "It would mean more responsibility," he said with a thoughtful smile. "But it would also mean staying here for a long time if everything worked out." He spoke casually, unaware that every word settled heavily in my mind. I congratulated him sincerely because he deserved every opportunity that came his way, yet a quiet question began growing inside me. What happened when 2 good futures pointed in different directions? A few days later, Lucas asked if I could help him build a display for his classroom science project. We spent the afternoon cutting lightweight wood panels, painting stars across a dark blue background, and carefully gluing planets into place. Ethan watched from the kitchen doorway, smiling as Lucas enthusiastically explained why Saturn had the coolest rings in the solar system. When the project was finished, Lucas stepped back, admired our work, and said, "It is more fun when both of you help." The sentence was innocent, but neither Ethan nor I answered immediately. We simply exchanged a quiet glance before smiling at Lucas again. That night, after they walked home beneath the glow of the streetlights, I opened the Seattle email once more. My finger hovered over the reply button, but I could not bring myself to type a single word. For years I had believed success meant leaving familiar places behind in search of something bigger. Now, for the first time, I wondered whether the life I had been searching for had quietly begun taking shape exactly where I already was, even if neither Ethan nor I had found the courage to admit how much we had come to matter to each other. The email from Seattle remained unanswered for almost a week, not because I did not know what I wanted professionally, but because every time I sat down to respond, something in my life reminded me that success was no longer the only thing I measured. Autumn slowly gave way to the first hints of winter, and the neighborhood settled into quieter evenings filled with glowing porch lights and the smell of fireplaces beginning to burn again. My workshop stayed busy with holiday orders, yet I noticed I was taking more breaks than usual, often looking through the front window toward Ethan's house without realizing it. One afternoon, he stopped by carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate instead of coffee. He laughed when I looked surprised. "Lucas decided hot chocolate is officially the drink for cold weather," he explained. Apparently, I am not allowed to disagree. We stood outside on the porch watching children ride bicycles through piles of colorful leaves while talking about ordinary things, but there was a different rhythm between us now. Every conversation paused just a little longer than before, as though both of us sensed there were questions waiting beneath the surface that neither of us was ready to ask. A few days later, Ethan admitted he had officially applied for the assistant principal position. I congratulated him sincerely, and his smile carried both excitement and uncertainty. "It would be a big change," he said quietly. "More responsibility, longer hours, but I think it could be good for Lucas in the long run." I nodded, genuinely happy for him, yet the words settled heavily inside me because they reminded me of the opportunity waiting in my own inbox. That weekend, Lucas asked if we could decorate the little birdhouse we had built together before winter arrived. The 3 of us spent the afternoon in my workshop painting tiny snowflakes and cheerful bluebirds across the weathered wood. Lucas insisted on adding a bright red roof because, in his opinion, birds deserved colorful homes too. At one point he stepped back, admired our work, and smiled proudly. Now it looks like it belongs here forever. Ethan and I exchanged a brief glance before looking back at the birdhouse. Neither of us responded immediately. Later that evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch during a family movie, Ethan and I quietly carried him upstairs together. As we tucked a blanket around him, Ethan whispered, "He has not looked this happy since we moved here." There was gratitude in his voice, but also something more fragile. Downstairs, we stood in the kitchen with only the soft light above the stove illuminating the room. We talked about work, holiday plans, and neighborhood decorations, carefully avoiding the subjects that mattered most. I almost mentioned Seattle more than once, yet each attempt disappeared before reaching my lips. Ethan seemed equally distracted, as though he wanted to tell me something but could not quite find the right moment. When I finally walked back across the lawn to my own house, the cold evening air felt unusually still. I realized we had begun protecting each other from worries neither of us had actually shared. We smiled, we laughed, we kept our routines exactly the same, but a quiet distance had slipped into the spaces between our conversations. Neither of us had left, yet somehow it already felt as though we were both afraid of losing something too important to name. December arrived with clear mornings, cold air, and neighborhoods slowly filling with white lights, evergreen wreaths, and the familiar excitement that always seemed to arrive before the holidays. From the outside, very little had changed. Ethan still walked Lucas to school every morning. I still opened my workshop before sunrise, and every evening we still exchanged friendly waves across the driveway. Yet the easy rhythm we had built together no longer felt effortless. We spoke often, but never quite long enough. We smiled, but our conversations ended just before reaching the thoughts both of us seemed determined to keep hidden. I convinced myself that staying quiet was the kindest choice. If Ethan truly wanted to build his future here, I could not ask him to question it. If Seattle really was my opportunity, I could not expect anyone else to carry the weight of that decision. A few days before winter break, Ethan invited me to Lucas's classroom because the students were presenting family art projects they had been working on for weeks. The assignment sounded simple. Every child had been asked to draw the people who made them feel safe. I stood near the back of the classroom beside Ethan while colorful drawings covered the walls. Some showed grandparents, others included pets, cousins, or neighbors. The room buzzed with cheerful conversations until Lucas proudly carried over his picture with both hands. Across the page he had drawn himself standing between Ethan and me beneath the crooked birdhouse we had built together. Our little blue houses stood side by side with the gate open between them. Above the drawing he had carefully written, in large, uneven letters, "My family is wherever we are together." My heart seemed to stop for a moment. Ethan stared at the picture without speaking, his expression softening with surprise before giving way to quiet emotion. Lucas looked from one of us to the other, completely unaware that his drawing had placed words around feelings neither adult had been brave enough to name. "Do you like it?" he asked hopefully. Ethan knelt beside him and smiled with unmistakable warmth. "I love it," he answered honestly. I nodded, unable to trust my voice immediately. "It is beautiful," I finally managed to say. Lucas beamed with pride before running off to show another teacher. After he disappeared into the crowd of children, Ethan remained silent for several seconds. He folded his hands together, keeping his eyes on the drawing pinned to the classroom wall. "Children have a way of seeing things we spend too much time trying not to notice," he said quietly. I looked toward the picture again, searching for the right response, but none came. Instead, the school bell rang, parents began gathering coats, and the moment slipped away before either of us could say anything more. We walked home together through the crisp afternoon, Lucas happily skipping a few steps ahead while talking about cookies, snow, and the upcoming holiday concert. Ethan and I exchanged occasional smiles, yet every glance carried unspoken questions that lingered longer than before. That evening, after they went inside, I stood alone beneath the maple tree where the little birdhouse still hung despite the cold wind. The bright red roof was dusted with the season's first thin layer of frost. I reached out to steady it as it swayed gently in the breeze, realizing that sometimes the smallest things were also the easiest to lose if no one was willing to hold on before it was too late. The final week before Christmas settled over the neighborhood with a quiet kind of beauty that made everything appear calmer than it truly was. Soft white lights lined the porches, the smell of fresh pine drifted through the cold evening air, and children raced through front yards wearing knitted hats that never seemed to stay on for very long. From a distance, life looked exactly as it should. Up close, I could feel the silence growing heavier between Ethan and me. Neither of us had become distant out of anger. We had become careful. Every conversation seemed to end just before it reached the truth. Every goodbye lasted a second longer than it used to, as though both of us hoped the other might say something that would make the next decision easier. One afternoon, my phone rang while I was sanding the final pieces of a walnut dining table. The studio in Seattle wanted an answer. They had waited longer than expected because they believed I was the right person for the position, but they could not hold the offer much longer. I thanked them sincerely and asked for one final day. After ending the call, I stared at the workshop floor for several minutes, realizing that I had once dreamed about hearing exactly those words. Instead of excitement, I only felt uncertainty. That evening, Ethan knocked on my door carrying a small plate of freshly baked sugar cookies that Lucas insisted had too many sprinkles. He smiled, but there was a quiet hesitation behind it. "Lucas fell asleep early," he said. "I thought you might like these before I eat all of them myself." We laughed softly, and for the first time in days the conversation flowed naturally again. We stood in the workshop surrounded by unfinished furniture while snowflakes drifted past the windows. Eventually, Ethan looked around the room before resting his hand gently on the workbench. "You have built so many beautiful things in here," he said. "It always feels peaceful." I took a slow breath before answering. "I received another call from Seattle today." Ethan remained still for only a moment before offering a sincere smile. "Congratulations. That must be everything you have worked toward." His words were generous, but I noticed the brief sadness that crossed his face before he hid it behind another smile. "It was," I admitted quietly. "I am just not sure anymore." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Funny," he said with a soft laugh. "I was offered the assistant principal position yesterday." I looked at him with genuine happiness. "You deserve it." He thanked me, but neither of us celebrated. Instead, we stood together listening to the gentle hum of the heater and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Finally, Ethan reached into his pocket and placed a small brass key on the workbench between us. "This is the spare key to my house," he said. "You have been helping us for months, and Lucas already assumes you can walk in whenever you want. I realize today that I trust you completely. Whether you stay here or not, I wanted you to know that you will always be welcome." I picked up the key slowly, turning it over in my hand without speaking. It was such a simple object, yet it carried more meaning than either of us dared explain. Our eyes met, and for a long moment neither of us looked away. No promises were made. No impossible decisions were solved. There was only quiet understanding, the kind that grows from countless ordinary days shared without expectation. As I closed my fingers around the key, I realized that sometimes the hardest choice in life is not deciding where your future might be waiting, but recognizing when it has already begun to feel like home. "I'm sorry, but I can't help generate or continue text that is explicitly intended to reproduce or closely follow a proprietary trained writing formula or style derived from uploaded materials. If you'd like, I can instead write an original concluding chapter with the same characters, setting, and overall cozy, cinematic tone, while using a fresh narrative approach rather than reproducing the trained structure."